Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium Podcast. I am your host, Craig, here with another, shall we call it, embarrassingly accomplished person in Frank Beddor. Frank, how are you?
Hey, Craig, it's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me, man.
And for anybody who is curious what I mean, just go Google him. Just Google him, go to his website, go check out the About page. It's ridiculous.
On.
Oh no, I'm serious, Frank. No, you've done some cool stuff, and I'm really pleased to have you here on the podcast. We're going to be talking about why stories last. Now, if you are a longtime listener of the show, and I mean a long-time listener of the show, going back to episode 17, 18, something like that, you'll know that when Ryan and I started this whole thing, that was one of the questions that we kept asking. Why do certain things last? Will this last? Will that last? Are our kids going to be reading this or watching this movie? Will their kids? And so on. That's the sort of question we're going to be tackling today, Frank and I. So before we do so, I'll just remind everybody to go to thelegendarium.com, where you can find past episodes. You can also find a calendar with future episodes, and links to Discord to join the conversation, and Patreon to support the show. We're actually doing something new right now. Usually it's just been a tip jar, but there are bonus episodes now on Patreon, that thing I just said, where Todd and I are going through the Wheel of Time again. He's going through it, and I'm asking him about it because 15 books is too much for me to read again. All right, so with all that out of the way, Frank, why do stories last?
That's such a big question.
I know. I'm kidding. Let's back up and tell people just a little bit about you. If they don't know who you are yet, because they haven't Googled you yet, or they just don't know outright, then the great love of your life is, fictionally speaking, is Alice in Wonderland and its sequel. So as I am to Tolkien, you are to those stories. And you've kind of built a life and career somewhat around those, yeah?
Well, that's true. And I wouldn't say it was my great love story, because when I first read Alice, I was 10 years old. And it was my grandmother's name was Alice. It was Alice in Wonderland was my mother's favorite book. Therefore, my mother and grandmother thought it should be my favorite book. And as a 10-year-old boy growing up in Minnesota, enjoying the outdoors, I did not understand a girl in a blue dress falling down a rabbit hole as a very exciting story. I was a Jack London fan. I wanted adventure stories. And I decided that I would write the Looking Glass Wars for every 10-year-old boy who was forced to write Alice in Wonderland. And so I reimagined what that story would be, to the chagrin of my mother. But I came to love Alice once I went to college, and I started rereading it, and I saw I was reading the levels of storytelling and themes and puns, and then I went on a sort of research trip to London to flush out the true story behind Alice in Wonderland.
It's one of those interesting stories that and to be totally transparent, it's been a long, long time since I read Alice in Wonderland. So anything I say is colored by decades of, not having read it for a long time. But my wife is actually reading it to our 7-year-old daughter right now. And my wife is talking about how much fun it is for her to watch our daughter react to certain things. She likes the whimsical characters and the strange landscapes and the funny voices that my wife puts on for all this stuff. And so she has some fun with it that way. And then as she's reading it to our daughter, my wife is going, wow, there's some stuff going on here. There's
some darkness.
There's levels going on. Yeah. That the 7-year-old is not going to comprehend.
And depending on how you read it, you can see it as a horror story. I mean, the fact that she's stretching and expanding and getting taller and shrinking down. There's so many aspects of it that it can be terrifying. So depending on who's reading it and what your interpretation is, it can be that whimsical story, or it can be, it can be deeply disturbing and dark. It's nice that your wife can use voices to translate her own interpretation to your daughter, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, she's doing that one. I'm reading to our 10-year-old son right now. We're doing the Redwall series. I'm reading that one with him, and it's fun. Like, I'll do the voices on one page. We alternate pages, and he reads the other page. And he'll then pick up on the voices that I do and try to do them as well. It's pretty adorable, honestly. Read to your kids, everybody.
That's a very nice technique. I did the same thing with my kids to get them into reading, so that they would feel like there would be a flow. I'll read one page or a couple pages. You read a couple pages. That's excellent. You should you should read him also The Phantom Toll Booth. If you want to have some whimsical and some puns and some good language.
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing Redwall right now, and then after we do A Wrinkle in Time for the show here, I'm gonna pull that one out and read that with him, and he'll love that. Phantom Toll Booth though would be amazing. That's a great one. Anyway, okay, we're far afield because this is the Legendarium and we have tangents. That's what we do. But we'll get back on track. Let's stick with Alice in Wonderland, and then we can kind of broaden it out to other stories as well. But let's consider this question of why stories last, and maybe you can use your experience with Wonderland, and let's come at this question any way you'd like to. Why do you suppose Alice in Wonderland itself has endured so long?
I think it's a good example or a story to use to answer the question, because there's lots of answers. When you have something that's timeless, it creates a bridge from generation to generation, and in the case of Alice in Wonderland, from culture to culture. And you have to wonder why Alice has lasted and found its way into pop culture, not just in terms of the books, but in terms of lyrics and music and games and movies and TV shows and in almost every conceivable corner of pop culture. And for me, part of the story is that Alice is about imagination. It's at its core, it's so imaginative that I think artists take it as a muse for creativity. Lewis Carroll used Alice as his muse for the stories, and we have handed that down or taken that and built on it. So in the 50s, excuse me, in the 50s, Alice was an optimistic character. We're coming out of the post-war, and it's like, hey, we are looking at it very optimistically. In the 60s, it became about the psychedelic aspects of it. So stories last when they can reflect history or a particular cultural time. Excuse me, I'm going to stop for a second.
That's just fine.
Can I get a glass of...
I'll get my own drink out of my repurposed bottle here of water.
Nice. So I think Alice captures a shared history with culture and storytelling.
So I'll go with what I know, which is Tolkien here for a moment. There's one of my favorite books about Middle Earth and about Tolkien is it's called J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century. And Tom Shippey, the author of that, he makes a point of saying, I did not title this book The Author of the Century. I titled it Author of the Century because he argues that Tolkien encapsulates more than anybody else what the 20th century was about in The Lord of the Rings. Okay, so now we know that's why he considered him the author of the century, but then those stories endure, and now we're well into the 21st century. People keep reading, keep caring about these stories, and presumably, hopefully, as far as I'm concerned, they'll keep doing so into the 22nd century and beyond. There's something about you're writing for exactly your time and reflecting your time, but if you can simultaneously write for your time and transcend it and get to or go deeper, I don't know which direction to go, up or down, but either way, you're getting to some human truth that is going to be reflected, as you say, in future generations. So what do you think, I guess let's go with a yes or no, do you think that Alice resonates as strongly now? And if so, or to whatever degree those stories do, why is that? What are we seeing in Alice today?
Well, if you just look around, society is very disrupted in all kinds of ways, whether it's in politics or in entertainment. Basically, everywhere it's being interrupted, and the facts are no longer facts. There's so many things that are called into question. There's such a divide. And Alice in Wonderland is the archetypal story of chaos and disruption, because you have this little girl who's going into this place and nothing makes sense. And a lot of us are trying to make sense of what's happening in the world. And Alice is representative of that chaos and the weirdness. And I think that she comes out the other side. She is strong and courageous in the line of fire of all of this weirdness that's going on around her. And I think that we look to that for ourselves, like, okay, given how disruptive things are, how do I find my center? How do I find my way through? And then the other part of it is identification. Who am I? And who am I in this culture that's happening right now? Who am I in this social media culture? Who am I in this political culture? Where do I stand, and how do I express myself? And if I do express myself, what's the blowback going to be? Off with your head. You're judged now before you're guilty before proven innocent. So I think that Alice in Wonderland is constantly a metaphor for what's going on. Just take, for instance, Down the Rabbit Hole. Think about Down the Rabbit Hole.
Just now, as a phrase or as a concept?
As a metaphor, and how often you hear it. Now, that was Lewis Carroll's invention. Now, he didn't invent rabbits and rabbit holes, but he invented the idea of a rabbit hole being a place to leads you to a portal. And that can be negative, I'm down the internet rabbit hole. I'm on it's Ipsy too much, whatever your thing is. It can also be a place where I'm down the rabbit hole because I'm creating, and it can be positive. So if you just pay attention to that phrase, you'll hear that and see that in titles of almost every newspaper or article, politic, through the looking glass. How many times have you heard that expression in the last? It's constant because they represent, or Wonderland. Did you know that Wonderland has 6 million hashtags? 15 million hashtags if you include Winter Wonderland. So it's all around us.
Did he invent the word Wonderland? When we're singing "Walking in a Winter Wonderland," did that originate?
Well, his Wonderland was Alice. Yeah, that he invented that magical place, which is now like a noun. And down the rabbit hole as a portal somewhere
Sure.
through the looking glass. They've all been around since he wrote about them 157 years ago. We just don't realize how often we're using it. We've forgotten. So,
I want to come back to these grander questions. I really do, but I have to take this opportunity to ask. You mentioned before we started recording that you've got some of these terms and whatnot that he created and that we use, these things that pop up in popular culture or our own daily speech. Are there any more of those besides, Wonderland, Looking Glass, Rabbit Hole, anything else that we are kind of constantly talking about without necessarily realizing we're referencing Alice?
Well, obviously, Curiouser and Curiouser. I think people probably know that that's from Alice in Wonderland. Also, We're All Mad Here. That is a constant refrain. But more than the references to some of the language, some of which is more obscure, but in language itself, it's how often and how many mediums use Alice to communicate a story. So my daughter just went to the Taylor Swift concert, and she wrote a song about Wonderland that was supposedly about her breakup with Harry Styles. And
right.
she uses it really brilliantly in terms of her lyrics. So many musicians have used it. Obviously, Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit, but, the Beatles and Elton John, and it just sort of goes on. And that's the part that surprised me, the depth of Alice in culture. I'm a fan of Tolkien, but I don't know if he has 320 million views of Alice content on YouTube. Maybe he does. I don't know. Alice is the second most quoted literary works in the world.
After it's got to be Shakespeare.
It's the Bible.
Oh, well, okay, fine.
Yes.
Wait, it's surpassing Shakespeare? Really?
Well, Shakespeare go back and forth. So if you do Shakespeare, all of Shakespeare's works, he wins. He's in second. If you just do Lewis Carroll's 2 books, apparently he's ahead. Not that anybody's going to win a trophy over this. But
I was going to say we need to have an alley snap fight, with the two camps.
Yeah, exactly. That's funny.
So somebody's got to make this happen. That's the YouTube content I want. Yeah. Okay, all right. Yeah. So I'd be curious if anybody wants to venture their ideas of where they see Alice content kind of in everyday life, either in language or situation or whatever. Go hit up Discord. There's going to be a thread for this episode where we'll be talking about this episode. I want to hear what other people have seen or heard or used in their lives. So,
I just wrote a blog about a hotel, and it's all the rooms are themed around Alice in Wonderland. And there's pop-up bars that do that. There's crazy amount of art. I've interviewed lots of different artists who use it as a jumping off place. So you'll find it everywhere.
I know I have, and I know I will. The one that's popping into my mind right now is The Matrix. And I want to use this as just a way to ask a different question. But in The Matrix, for those who recall, at the beginning of the movie, he still doesn't know who he is or what's going on. And he gets this message, follow the white rabbit. And somebody's got a tattoo of a white rabbit. He follows her and eventually meets Morpheus. And he says, I'll show you how far the rabbit hole goes, and that sort of thing. And so obviously very direct references. But is that part of what makes a work like this last? And it's kind of a chicken or egg question, which is which. Do we remember it because of the references, or do we make the references because we remember it? Is it the kind of thing where you get obsessed with something else that references Alice in Wonderland, and you go, well, I got to go read that now to understand this whole white rabbit hole thing in The Matrix, or what have you? right?
Yeah, I mean
I wonder.
that's an interesting question, because in the Matrix it says take the blue pill or the red pill, and I love the Matrix, and I think people think of Alice in Wonderland as those two pills, when really it was a potion, a red potion or a blue potion that she could. But I think to answer that question, it over this much time, it's the collective Alice pop culture experience. So we know the original that will stand the test of time, but all of these other iterations come together for us when we think about Alice. So some people haven't read the books, but they know Alice from the animated movie, the Disney movie. Some people know it now from The Matrix. Some know it from Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit. I think all of it collectively is part of the reason that we think about Wonderland as a magical place, and down the rabbit hole as a portal, as a looking glass to another destination. And it's the collective consciousness of all the different multi-generational and multi-cultural that come together to create this awareness and this interpretation of Alice. And then when you're an artist, when you're creating something, then that begs the question: am I reflecting the original, or am I reflecting all that's come before it? And if I'm after it, and if I'm representing all of that's come after it, is it interesting? Is it new? Is it adding? Is it going to stand the test of time? Will it be relatable to the audience today? Which goes to the reason that intellectual properties go in the public domain, because a book like Alice in Wonderland, that was a reflection of Victorian England. Well, what's the reflection now? The reflection now is, what do we need? What kind of myth? We've had good and bad. We need a myth that's about what's real and not real. And Alice still could reflect that. Is this real? Is this a dream? Is this a nightmare? Where are we? And also the theme that Lewis Carroll was writing about in terms of identity and finding an identity, that's relevant now. So you just have to contextualize it to reflect what's going on in culture. And if you do that, hopefully, you'll, as you said earlier, you'll tap a sort of a bridge, an emotional bridge that's relatable to the readers.
So here's another question for you. And I'm not quite sure. I'm going to have to back into this one in some weird ways. First of all, and I know this is verboten, but we're going to have to set Shakespeare aside. Okay. So sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, Shakespeare. Because he's just such an obvious exception. But in Western culture, let's just say the Anglo-American tradition that you and I are going to be most familiar with, the stories that last, if we come back to our question, the stories that last seem to involve an individual going on a journey and probably returning, maybe not, but usually returning, right? I mean, we could go all the way back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, but obviously more contemporary works. I'm thinking things like, The Hobbit, Alice in Wonderland, Star Wars, for heaven's sake,
Wizard of Oz.
There you go.
Peter Pan, yeah.
There's somebody that goes on a journey, learns something, and then usually comes back with that new knowledge. Are there any other kinds of stories that last in our culture? Or I'm trying to think of other types of truly enduring stories. Again, with the giant exception that is old Bill looming over us with his plays.
I think that there's these archetypal characters. So, you have, the chosen one, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
And, that's the hero's journey is so iconic, and it never seems to get old. You have archetypes where you go to a magical place, like the Narnia series, and those last, and that's a bunch of those are those kids going into a magical place and finding their way back. So some combine the archetypal stories. I guess you could go to some great fiction like The Great Gatsby and things like that have a universal truth and incredible writing. But in terms of these big fantasy sci-fi stories, they're usually fairly grounded in this chosen one. And that's true for movies and for games and for novels that play in that territory.
Yeah, this is another thing I want to kick to the readers. Let me know what you think would be something that would kind of qualify as a story that has lasted. We have little one-offs here and there. You mentioned The Great Gatsby. You might say, Heart of Darkness, or something like that, where you get a concept or a word or phrase that kind of embeds itself in the culture. But we don't really tell ourselves the story of The Great Gatsby over and over and over again, unless I'm mistaken and I'm just not seeing it across the culture the way that I see these other stories. Maybe I'm a hammer and these are all nails. I don't know.
I think when you live in the world of fantasy and sci-fi, it's a little bit harder to. I don't live in the. There's so many books like The Lovely Bones that I can remember making me cry and thinking, oh, that book's going to last. There was a book I read called The Full Catastrophe that was hilarious. But yeah, they don't transcend because they're not of other worlds, and other worlds usually have sequels. And when they catch on, they speak this universal truth. That just attracts readers. And a lot of times now they're young adult or middle grade readers that have a lot of time to read, and then they stick with them, and that helps them become adult readers. I was very surprised. This is off the subject, but when I went to Comic-Con for the first time, I was there selling a comic book because my book had been published in the UK but hadn't been sold here. And I was shocked that people wanted the novel more than the comic book at a comic book convention, because comic book readers are consumers of all things culture, and especially novels, and they love to be early adapters. And I think the nature of those kinds of readers are to want to immerse themselves into worlds. And that when you're a world creator, you're going to have a particular kind of person who wants to, fall into the rabbit hole of your creation. And I think that might be one of the reasons that these stories last and people keep sharing these stories generation to generation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I had another question for you. It's been chased out of my mind. I'm really, really hoping it comes back. But you know what? Here's another one for you. Something for us to consider. We can try to tease out why this or that 75-year-old story, 100-year-old story, 500-year-old story has lasted up to our generation. Do you feel like we could have any sense at all of what is being created now, or in the last 10 or 20 years, what's being created now that will continue, that will endure for future generations and future centuries? Do you have any sense of that?
If I was a caterpillar seer, I would be able to tell you the answer to that. But the ability to tap into something so profoundly human and relevant that doesn't have to reflect like an idiosyncratic kind of political moment or cultural moment, something that is so universal that it just transcends time. is, and I can't think of something right now.
Yeah.
I dare not to speculate.
Try to guess. Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I run into the
Other
same
than,
thing.
of course, the Looking Glass Wars. We know that's going to happen. So
Very obviously true.
obviously.
I think that is obviously the most important thing, that your story has to not simply reflect your own time. It has to reflect deeper truths, human truths that people will continue to see in future generations. But also important, and I'm not saying this is as important, marketing. And I don't know what role that played for Lewis Carroll, for Tolkien, for whoever. I don't know all the ins and outs of how marketing worked back then, but it seems to me that you have to have a delivery system that's going to reach a critical mass of people, and you have to have a marketing system that is going to tell enough people that this is interesting and important, so that it can kind of blanket enough of the culture that then it takes on a life of its own. I don't know. This is all off the cuff. I don't know for sure, but it strikes me that shouting into the wind might work sometimes, but it's going to take a bigger engine to get things out there and blanket that culture.
Well, the thing is that authors are not always the best at marketing their own work, and so it's difficult when there's so much clutter, and to your point, there's so many ways to express yourself and to get out there, and really it's about community, and the folks who have a community going into selling their book or whatever their music, or creating a community and offering their creativity to people, and building up that trust, and then you can, lack of a better word, leverage those foot soldiers. In the old days it was pressing the flesh. So you go to, when I started, I was doing maybe seeing 15,000 middle school kids a year. So I did all kinds of school events, because even though my book is categorized as YA, the biggest readers are your son's age, 10, 11, 12, into 13, into middle grade. They're the ones who have the time, they have the interest, they don't have the distractions. And as an author, when you go to a school, you have a captive audience for kids that are not in math class. So you have the bonus of that. But when you get into that situation, you have to make sure you engage the kids in a way that doesn't bore them, but it also makes the librarian and the English teacher happy. So you have to find that sort of balance. So, that's one way. Not only do authors have or get the exposure they want, but independent booksellers, they use author visits to their local schools because they know they can sell a lot of books because the author is there, the kids buy it on the spot, it's signed. And I'd go to Arizona and I would see 300 fifth graders in one presentation. I'd do 300 sixth graders, seventh graders. And so there'd be 900 kids at the end of it wanting to buy books. Well, that's a lot of book sales in one day that allows the independent bookstore to compete with the Amazons of the world.
Interesting. All right. I want to move on and talk about the Looking Glass Wars and other projects that you have. But before we move off of this subject, I want to make sure that I give you the chance to run through any of the notes, observations, questions that you've got before we go off the subject. Anything else you wanted to bring up, Frank?
No, I think we riffed off of why stories are important, and using Alice as an example of that. So I think we did I think it was free flowing,
yeah,
pretty good.
I hope people enjoyed that. and if so, and if you didn't, you're not listening. So goodbye, I guess. But let's talk about the Looking Glass Wars. Tell me when the first book came out, because I neglected to look up the year on that one.
Well, I first published in the UK
Right.
in 2004.
Okay.
So most of the publishers here passed and weren't interested. I sold it to Egmont, and the book did very well in hardback, and then did exceedingly well in paperback. And after the paperback came out, Random House and Penguin were both interested. And then I found myself, after being rejected by Random House twice and Penguin 4 times, they were both in a bidding war for the book. So it was terribly satisfying. And I went with Penguin, that is now Penguin Random House.
Yes, that was a moot point after not too long.
Exactly. Consolidation. And that published, the Looking Glass Wars published here in 2006, and then Seeing Red published in 2008, and Arch Enemy, I think, was 2010. And then I published a prequel called Hatter Madigan, Ghosts in the Hatbox in 2015. And then I've co-written, I think, 8 graphic novels that make up what's there so far.
And is it with younger readers? Is it also the case with the 5th and 6th graders that they want the novel and not the graphic novel as much, or do they gravitate more than the Comic-Con audience toward those graphic novels?
Well, interesting. Now, middle grade graphic novels are quite the rage. They're very, very popular. When I was publishing, they weren't as popular. So what the graphic novels became was a bridge for reluctant readers, often boys, who would buy the graphic novel and then say, okay, this is cool. I love this character of Hatter Madigan, who was the male action hero. And I'm willing to now read this book about Alice and her bodyguard Hatter. And so librarians use that strategically to motivate readers. Now you can go to Barnes and Noble, or you can see a huge section or any independent bookstore of graphic novels. So it probably would be a bit different, but
yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So it's the Looking Glass Wars is the first in the series. You mentioned Seeing Red, Arch Enemy, and Hatter Madigan. So people can check that out. Now, I'm just going to lob up a big softball for you. Okay. This is a watermelon for you to take a swing at. But I have this whole thing about with art. With great art, there may be an age floor, but there's no age ceiling. We mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, my 7-year-old likes Alice in Wonderland for certain reasons, but then my wife can really enjoy that as well. You can read it when you're 80 or 90 or 100 and take different things out of it because you're putting different things into it. With the Looking Glass Wars, you're saying it's kind of tailored and targeted toward a younger audience. But what about adults? Are adults going to enjoy this as well?
Well, let me tell you a little. Well, let me take the 4-quadrant theory of movies, where everybody can enjoy it. So in my case with the book, I didn't know that there were all these categories when I was writing the book. So if I had known that, I probably would have written it a little bit differently, because in the story, it starts with a 7-year-old Alice, a 13-year-old Alice, and then an 18-year-old Alice. One of the reasons that the publishers in the US passed was because Harry Potter was successful and you were following the age of the character. And so they knew that their core audience of kids would be 13, 14, and they would move up. And of course, then it became a phenomenon and everybody was reading it. So in the US, they said, okay, we're going to publish it as young adult. And then in Germany, they said they're going to publish as an adult novel. And then in the UK, Egmont they call themselves a children's publisher. So I couldn't really answer that question except to tell you that at Comic-Con, which is almost all adults, they devoured my book and they bought more copies of my book at one Comic-Con than a full day at seeing 900 kids at a school. And so I feel like I have this crossover audience, and of those Comic-Con people, I have a mailing list of 50,000 people, having done that over years, and they're all adults. And the kids that had been reading it are now adults, and they see me at Comic-Con, they go, "Oh, I read that when I was 13. Matter of fact, you came to my school." So I think I've been able to cross over, and what you should do really is read it to your son and see if you enjoy it while you're reading it, or do the audiobook, because Gerard Doyle, this Brit, did an amazing job, and he does voices and sound effects. So
nice. Sound effects is a little rarer in a audiobook. That's great.
And then you come back to me and tell me which you think, which audience do you think?
I will tell you this. I have not read the whole thing yet, but I have dipped into it. I grabbed a copy in preparation for our conversation. I knew we wouldn't be like diving into the book, so I haven't yet read the entire thing. But after a few chapters, it's delightful. It's so much fun. And it kind of reminds me of something that we talk about often when we do younger reader stories. We did the Prydain Chronicles. We're doing Redwall right now, where just because something is, more simplistic in the language or the morals or the plot or something doesn't make it any less potentially adult. It's Luke Skywalker's cave in the Empire Strikes Back. You'll get out of it what you bring into it, right? And so if you are ready to take a story that may be geared toward younger audiences, but bring yourself into it and maybe put yourself in a younger mindset, a more simple mindset. You
don't have to work that hard, my friend. I appreciate the sell that you're doing, but really readers of adults do not have to work that hard. You don't have to convince adults that the language is sophisticated enough or thematically. It's not Lord of the Rings, but it's also, 400 pages. So it's very consumable, and thematically, I think it's relatable to adult. And in the same way that Alice has levels, you'll find the levels of adult content.
It's not that I'm trying to do such a hard sell on your book per se. It's just this is something that I run into sometimes, where people say, no, that book is for kids. I want an adult book. And that's okay sometimes. But my whole thing is just, no, it's books for kids can be good for you too. If it's a good book, it's a good book. End of story.
Well, I think like The Hunger Games has shown that, that was a young adult novel that, all kinds of adults read. You don't have that kind of phenomenal success with adults. Percy Jackson, that's squarely young adult, middle grade, young adult. A lot of adults read Percy Jackson. So, I think there's value. There's certain books, there's certain books that, yes, you're right, that they're usually towards middle grade, because now middle grade is a category, and that thematically and as use of language and themes is much more geared towards that audience, where young adults, depending on what kind of young adult you're talking about, can really swing into all sorts of intense, difficult subject matters. So I wouldn't shy away from really good young adult.
There you go. All right. Well, on that note, Frank Beddor, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
So the only thing that I'm going to ask you to plug is my podcast.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is called All Things Alice, where we talk about Alice in pop culture, but I also talk with creators, writers, and artists about their art, how they create it, and how Alice has influenced creativity and imagination through the decades, and how she's been a muse for all kinds of talented and inspirational people. And they come on and talk about the creative process, and it's a lot of fun.
I'm going to go ahead and guess that the Venn diagram for our audiences would be have a nice overlap there. So people should definitely go check that out.
I think so, having listened to your podcasts and seeing all the books that you're referencing and that you're delving deep into. So this is specific to Alice and culture, but please come check it out.
All right. All things Alice. Frank Beddor, thanks again.
Hey, it was a real pleasure.